I want to ask Fred Hornshoe, as I said before, a pastor from First Assembly, to come up. He's known our speaker, Bob Gause, for some time, and I want to ask Pastor Hornshoe to introduce him to us tonight, okay?
Thank you, Andy. I appreciate the opportunity to introduce to you a personal friend of mine. Bob Gause's story he will tell, but I would just like to mention a little bit of his background to you. Bob, whom I met in St. Petersburg, Florida, several years ago, is chairman of the Board of Regents of the Florida Beacon College, and this really is his first love. But in the business world, he started out before and after World War II in the banking business and the lumbering business. At present is developing a large part of the Swanee River in Florida. I appreciate very much him bringing the sunshine to Portland. Bob is the first guest of mine since last November that I haven't had to apologize to about the Portland weather. About 22 years ago, Bob Gause founded a bank with $250,000, and this year the assets are $400 million. The Lord has blessed Bob. He has given liberally every opportunity that he has had. Last year, his project was the donation of a new library to the Florida Beacon College. His wife, who shares his love for the Lord, is well known as a speaker in the southeast and the eastern part of our country. And in the east or in the south, if I were introducing Bob Gause, all I would have to do is say, here's Bob Gause, and everybody would know who he is. This is his first or his second time that he's been in our city, and so I did want to share this with you. But his wife, Dr. Norma Neal Gause, resigned her position as professor at the Florida University to join the staff of this full gospel college in the South, and is now the dean of the college, and upon her shoulders and Bob's shoulders, much of the furtherance and the financing of the college rests, and they've done nobly, and they are thanked and appreciated very much in the South. We're very happy to have Bob with us tonight. His story, if the Bible were still being written, his story would rank along with stories like Jonah and the whale or Daniel and the lion's den. And I'm sure that you who heard him Saturday night here or today, Sunday and today, I was with Bob as I introduced him in churches in Albany Sunday morning, Eugene Sunday night, and this morning at the Eugene Bible College, where the young folks there were just stirred beyond words as they appreciated and just felt the very lift of the power of the Lord as he shared his story. There are many, many things that Bob cannot tell us tonight, and he will be careful in what he says. We've just had dinner. The human body cannot take what he has taken, but the Lord did it for him. And I want you to appreciate, and I know you will love Bob in a Christian love as you already do, but after you hear his story, as he gives God all the glory for what the Lord has done for him. Bob Gause.
Thank you, Fred. I'm going to have to give a pretty good story after an introduction like that. You know, Fred started on this Jonah and the whale bit this morning when we were at this Eugene Bible College, and I didn't know whether I'd get thrown out or not, but I thought I'd get the young people's attention, and I told them that I had spoken one time to a group of Christian boys at a Christian school, and I asked them what they were studying about, and they said Jonah and the whale. He had reminded me of that, and I said, well, what are you studying about it? And the little boy in the front row said, well, the whale swallowed Jonah, and I said, I believe that's right. What do you suppose he did after he swallowed? And he thought a minute. He said, I imagine he prayed. And I said, well, what do you suppose that he prayed? And the little fellow smiled, and he said, I imagine he prayed he'd get out of there the same way he got in. Well, they didn't get rid of me. I got away with it. You know, I'm not a speaker. I listen to all of these great speakers that you're going to have coming here, and I'm just a man that loves the Lord. And I've got something to talk to you about tonight I want to talk to you about fish, and I want to talk to you about prayer. And he said tonight they've got a question about why some prayers aren't answered. I would like to be in on that discussion, for I feel that they are. Sometimes we don't recognize an answer. But I think that if you're in tune with God, your prayers are answered. This morning I talked to the young people there about how to tune up that direct line that they have with God. I feel like I have it. I was embarrassed when he asked for an offering tonight. The Lord has been so good to me. He just provides every time I get an opportunity to go someplace to speak. And I pay my own expenses, every dime that comes in anything like this. And for several years we didn't even mention an offering. But it all goes to Florida Beacon Bible College, where we are training missionaries and pastors, and the Lord just provides a way for me. Well, I'm not a wealthy man. My wife said, "Bob, how in the world are you going to fly?" One time I flew to Alaska to speak to 15 businessmen that were forming a full gospel businessmen chapel in Kodiak, Alaska. That's a long ways from Tampa, Florida to Alaska. And the wife said, "How are you going to go?" And I said, "Well, tomorrow the Lord will sell a piece of real estate for us." And he did. And so we went to Alaska. Back during the Second World War, I was aboard a little tanker that operated in and out of Miami, Florida, and we operated to Cuba and hauled 100-octane aviation fuel. And my wife was expecting our first child, and she lived in Tarpon Springs, Florida, across the state from Miami, and she wanted to come see me. I was coming in and out of port all the time, and against the doctor's orders, she flew down to see me. And our child was born the next day, prematurely. And we ran up quite a few bills, and back there then, the Navy didn't pay all your bills. The government didn't pay all of them. And so I got a 72-hour pass, and I hitchhiked across the state. And my dad owned a fish business, and I borrowed one of the boats and went commercial fishing. And on the way out that night, I had a Navy buddy with me, and I said, "Bob," I said, "we need 4,500 pounds of fish tonight. I know what they're bringing. My dad's buying them. And we need 4,500 pounds of fish for me to pay the bills that I've got. And I'm going to pray about it." And so I explained to the Lord just what I needed and what I needed it for. And you know how you do those things. You go into all kind of details when you're in need. And I really explained it to him. There's a certain way that you catch mackerel down there. You catch them by seeing them first in the water, by the phosphorus in the water, and you have 1,000 yards of net on the back of a boat and a buoy tied to the end of it, and you find the fish and get them where you want them and set the end of the net over and make a circle around them, tie the ends together, and you get inside with a spotlight and run round and round in there and run them into the net, and they gill in it. And if you don't do it in that manner, you don't catch anything. And that night I found a body of fish and got halfway around them, and the boat conked out, and I couldn't get the ends together, and nothing went right. Nobody had come and helped me or anything, and the engine had gotten so hot that it burnt up, and the engine box was so hot. When I started taking up my net, though, it was full of fish. And I just caught fish, 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 and we piled fish in the 26-foot boat. We just loaded it down with them, and when we got in the next afternoon, somebody towed us in finally, and we got in, and some of the fish around the engine box had spoiled. But when we weighed out the good ones, they came to 4,500 pounds. Right, exactly, 4,500 pounds. If it only been 4,600 pounds, I'd say, "Thank you, Lord, you overdid it." If it had been 4,400, I'd have said, "Well, he almost did it," but he didn't. He gave me what I asked for. And I thought since then, well, now I'd have gotten along without the 4,500 pounds of fish, but he was teaching me something. He was teaching me what my mother had been teaching me that was in the Bible for years, that the Lord answers your prayers. And he was building my faith, knowing that he answered. And I think that that's the reason that he got it right down to the pound for me. And I know it saved my life at a later date. And tonight I'm going to tell you about it. I got shipped out of out of Key West, Florida, to Shoemaker, California. Some of you fellows will know about Shoemaker, California. That was the amphib base during the Second World War, and I was scared to death I was going to be sent out on an amphibious ship, and I sure didn't want to do that. I was a senior quartermaster on the base at that time, and they shipped me out on the USS Indianapolis, the flagship for the Fifth Fleet. They needed a chief quartermaster, and they didn't have one in the base, so they sent 2 first class out there. They figured that 2 first class might make a chief one of these days, so I got to go aboard the USS Indianapolis as their senior quartermaster. And the USS Indianapolis was the flagship for the 5th Fleet. We carried Admiral Spruance aboard our ship. That was the ship that carried the atomic bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Carried a complement of 1,200 men. It was 667 feet long. That's the length of 2 city blocks. I never did get to know all of the men that was on that ship. You don't know that many. You only know the fellows in your division or something, but we got into 5 major engagements while I was aboard the USS Indianapolis. We were in on the first 3 airstrikes in Japan. We were in on Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and Natsushima, and battles like that. At Okinawa, we got hit by a suicide plane, and it killed a bunch of men in my division. And up until that time, I had to stand no watches. I was a senior quartermaster, and I set the watch list, and I assisted in navigation, and I steered the ship during battle or in and out of port. But I had to stand watches after that. We were short on hands, and they put me in, or I put myself in steering aft. Some of them said that I was afraid, that they noticed I never did take the steering aft watch. That's 5 decks below, 5 stories down in a heavy cruiser, and they dog you down all the way down. That means that they can't get out unless the guy above you lets you out. I have claustrophobia. And we had 5 airstrikes while we were down there, the 5 days I spent in steering aft. And we came back to the States and got patched up. And soon after we got patched up, well, while we were being patched up, my wife flew out to the coast to visit me. And we were supposed to go from Hunters Point, California to San Diego for aerial gunnery practice. And one afternoon or one evening, the captain called for quarters, and he said, "There'll be no more liberty. We're going back into the war zone in the morning." Well, after everybody went to sleep, I jumped ship, and I went ashore and told my lovely wife that she'd just well go back to Florida, that tomorrow we'd be sailing for overseas. And I guess that's what they didn't want you to do, but I had to tell her that we were not going to be there. So she was standing on the Golden Gate Bridge the next morning and waving at me, and I didn't dare wave at her as I was steering the ship going out. I kind of looked at her like that. But we had these 2 great big cartons in the flight deck, or in the hangar deck on this heavy cruiser, and we didn't know what they were. We had 1,200 men on there, and there was 1,199 different guesses as to what they were, and I thought they were inter-spring mattresses for the Marine Corps, the way they were guarding them. They really guarded these boxes. And you know, it was just about 3 years ago that I found out that the bomb parts weren't even in the hangar deck. They carried them up into the officers' quarters, and they had these things in the hangar deck in case anybody had the word that we had something on there to divert their attention. And when we got to Tinian, we set a world record speed run on the way over. The bridge on a heavy cruiser is 65 feet above the water, and we went so fast going over there that the waves, some of them, broke clear across the bridge, 65 feet in the air. And we got to Tinian and unloaded the bombs. We didn't have any idea then what they were. And we went from Tinian on into Guam, which is about 6 hours, I guess. You can make it overnight. We got there and unloaded the Admiral's staff. The Admiral hadn't come back to the States with us. He was still in Guam, but we unloaded part of his staff. And there's a question about how many guys were picked up after we sunk, and Fred was asking me that, and I said, I really don't know how many men we lost in the sinking of that ship, because we had some passengers aboard, but we had 1,200 men in the complement of the ship, crew and officers. But we unloaded the Admiral's staff, and the next morning they were to send us to Leyte Gulf for aerial gunnery practice to synchronize our guns before we went back. And our ship had all the teletype equipment loaded on it. We thought that the surrender of Japan would soon be, and it would be held on the oldest ship that we had there, the USS Indianapolis. I didn't know until later that all that equipment had been put on there. But the old man asked for an escort to go, and they said, no, you don't need an escort. if you traveled halfway around the world by yourself to deliver a few crates, you don't need escort to go 2 days or 4 days down to Leyte Gulf for aerial gunnery practice. And they didn't send any ship with us. Now, a heavy cruiser doesn't have submarine detection. It may have today, I don't know, but back there then it didn't have any submarine detection. Didn't have any depth charges. You had no way of fighting a submarine. The only thing you could do would be to outrun it. And 2 days out of Guam, we got a radio message that there was a Japanese submarine in our path. Well, we'd been in so many major engagements, and we had been in the Pacific a number of times. The ship came from the Atlantic, and they'd already had the Battle of the Atlantic over there, and they had had submarine reports so many times that nobody got real excited about it. We doubled up on the watch and things like that, but the night order book was written up, and the captain of our ship, Captain McVeigh, had me write into the night order book that if it was an overcast night, the moon didn't come out, for us to continue on our course at 15 knots, but that if it was a clear night, they were to commence zigzagging. I'm telling you this because our captain was court-martialed for not zigzagging. That night, well, before that, though, I had a terrible case of boils, and I couldn't go down below deck. It was so hot below deck, and on a heavy cruiser, they make you button your cuffs and everything so that if you have a fire, you don't get burned, and I just couldn't stand the heat down there. I'd break out in boils, so I was sleeping topside on in the catapult tower, the thing that shoots the little sock planes that we had out, the observation planes. And so about 10 minutes of 12 or 5 minutes of 12, I went to bed that night, Sunday night, in the catapult tower. And this Japanese submarine was right there, and we didn't know it, and he surfaced, and about the time he surfaced to charge his batteries and had gotten out on the deck, and we know all about it because the Japanese submarine came to, the commander came to the United States and testified against one of our own officers in a court-martial case. I have a little problem with that yet today. He surfaced and he saw this ship coming through there. The moon broke out for just a minute and he thought it was a big battle wagon, and he said that he submerged real quick and waited until it got right abreast of him, which was just no time at all. It was right on him before he ever saw it, and he fired 4 torpedoes. And the first one hit our ship, and I thought it had run into something, thought the ship had run into something, and it blew me up under a handrail that runs around inside the catapult tower. A rail sticks out there and it wedged me in there. Blew 165 feet of the forecastle off. That's the bow of the ship. And the second torpedo hit us midship and split the ship wide open. It hit the magazine. Well, my bunk was only two decks above the magazine, and had I been in there, I would have been like some of the fellows that I saw come streaming out of there, and they were on fire, and they didn't even slow down. They just hit the well deck and right overboard like a bullet. And they were lost right then. But the second one blew me out from under this big thing that I had been wedged in, and I had contusion of the spine. I don't know how I got to my battle station. It was 65 feet in the air, but I got up there and there wasn't anybody forward of the wheel at all. There wasn't any ship forward of the wheel. It had all been blown off. Up to our 8-inch guns, they were sticking straight up in the air. And I went around behind the bridge, and the captain and the gunnery officer and a couple of quartermaster strikers and a bugler was there. And I don't know how I didn't see them as I went by them going to my battle station, but they were standing back there. And I turned to the quartermaster striker, and the ship was listing so then to starboard side it had about a 45-degree list, and I said, "Allard, we're fixing to sink, buddy." "No," he said, "we've been hit so many times since I've been on here in the last 5 years," and he said, "this ship isn't going to sink." And I said, "Well, I haven't been on here that long, but I've been on the sea all my life." And I said, "When a ship lifts that far and it just quivers like that and it doesn't come back, and then it lifts again a little bit more and it doesn't come back, something's going to happen before long, or you're going to be standing on the keel." And the captain knew this, and the captain had been sending a messenger aft to get a radio message off, an SOS or anything, giving our location, because we were traveling during wartime, and our exact location isn't like it is now. They know today with our sophisticated gear just exactly where every ship is, even if it's a submarine below the surface. Our instruments tell them where it is today. But we didn't have this equipment. And the captain finally said, well, I'm going aft myself and find out why a messenger doesn't report back to me that we got an SOS off. Well, I gave him my life jacket. I knew the captain very well. And he didn't have on a life jacket, and I said, Captain McVeigh, the well deck is awash. I just came from there. Take my life jacket. So he took my life jacket, and I turned to this quartermaster striker and said, Allard, buddy, we're fixing to sink, and I don't have a life jacket. And he said, man, in the signal bridge, I've been playing poker down there, and sitting on life jackets, there's a whole stack of them. And so he went down and came up with 2 of them. And life jackets were very important. We didn't know it at that time, but having carried these atomic bombs at such fast speed, we had lashed down all of our life rafts and the lifeboat that we had on there and had not unsecured them so that they'd float off of the ship. They were still secured. And we didn't know that at the time. But soon after he brought these 2 life jackets up and handed them to me, he handed me a Mae West, and he handed me one of these type that you put on like an inner tube that goes around you and you blow it up. Commander Flynn said, prepare to abandon ship. Well, you know, that ship sunk in 10 minutes after it was hit. But I had been prepared to abandon ship about 6 or 8 minutes. I figured that it was going to sink, and I was ready. And when he said to prepare to abandon ship, I thought I'd better get off of it, because I had heard that when a big ship went under like that, the suction pulled everything around it with it. And I had no intention of being pulled down if I could help it. So I started running down the side. Somebody asked me yesterday or today, said, Bob, how far did you have to jump to the water? And I said, well, I took the first jump, and I jumped and ran right into the bilge keel. The ship had leaned over so that you could just run down the side, and I don't suppose I had to jump 6 feet to get into the water when I once got to it. And I jumped overboard, and it was 12 o'clock on Sunday night. I didn't have a bit of fear in the world about going in the water. The only fear I had at that time was to get away from that ship so that I wouldn't be pulled under. And I swam as hard as I could swim, and I got out there about 150 yards away from the ship, and somebody had gone overboard before I did because I ran into him, and he didn't have a life jacket. And so I said, fella, I've got 2 of them. Which kind would you rather have? And he said, I'll take that kind you blow up. He said, we're going to be in the drink a long time, fella, and that other one's only good for 72 hours. Well, this actually happened, and I thought, well, now that's the first big mistake I remember ever making. Let me tell you something about those life jackets. If you ever get a chance, put on a Mae West. Don't put on one of those kind you blow up, because you jump around in it and you bounce around in it for 4 days and 5 nights like I did, and you wear holes in it, and when you wear more than 10 holes in it, you're in trouble. This fella didn't make it, but my life jacket held me up. Not by itself. I'll tell you about that a little bit later. Anyway, we began to form a group, and the moon broke out again in just a very few minutes, just for a second, and I looked back, and the ship was standing right on in, and there was about 300 or 400 guys hanging on the life rail, right on the fantail of the ship. And I talked to these survivors every 5 years, and they said when that ship went under, it didn't suck a soul under with it. It just slid under the water so easy, and they drifted off of it like flies. We estimate that maybe 300 men went down with the ship. In a Navy ship like that, a big ship, you have what we call watertight integrity. And when you get hit, you give a party so many seconds to get out of a compartment. You seal it up then. If the guy didn't make it, if you see him coming, you're to seal it right in his face. You have no choice. I wasn't forced with that, where some of them did. And then the black gang, the engineers, the mechanics that we had, and that's the name that we had. Mine was called the Nan Division, the Nan Gang. These engineers stayed down in the engine room and cranked up the submersible pumps to try to hold the ship afloat. And those men went down with the ship. We estimate that about 300 went down, and I'll tell you in a few minutes how we estimate how many was left there. About an hour after the ship sunk, I saw something waving out there again, and I was telling Fred that I only saw the moon break out 3 times that night, and I saw something every time that it came out, so there was a lot of activity going on there, and I saw this thing waving, and I thought, well, that's another guy in trouble, and I swam just as hard as I could to get to it. And I swam up about as close as the piano, and about 6 feet in front of that was a dorsal fin sticking up about that high. And that was the shark's tail cut in the water there. Well, you know this young fella that won all the Olympic races that had polio? He didn't ever race me. I didn't even bother to turn around. I just kicked it in reverse. And you talk about somebody that was making some time. I really did. I got back to this group of fellows that were there, and it was a pretty good-sized group, but we were just kind of scattered all in a room about like this, see, and you would be scattered very close to this size. And I said, "Fella, we need to form a great big circle, and I need to get in the middle of it." There's a shark out there that just won't wait. And we did form a circle. And some guy had about a 50-foot piece of rope, and I don't know yet why anybody went overboard carrying a piece of rope, but we were sure glad that we had it. And the Mae West life jacket, you have 2 rings on each side of it. And we ran the rope through the rings, and we'd form a great big circle like that and tie the rope, and the guys with the rubber inner tube type things got on the inside. That put me on the outside circle. And somebody said, "Gause, how many sharks do you suppose you saw?" And I said, "I don't know. I never did try to count them, but I saw sharks all the time that I was there. Not all the time, but every day that I was there except one day. One day I didn't see a shark. But you'd see a shark about this long in the daytime, and it'd be perfectly clear water if the oil broke away and you could see down there, and he'd look about that long, and when he got up on the surface, he'd be about 4 or 5 feet between his fin and his tail. And he'd swim up as close as this gentleman to you and kind of grin at you like that, and he'd swim round and round the group, round and round the group. I never did have a shark try to bite me. But in the picture Jaws, maybe some of you saw that, this fella Quint had to have some reason for killing the big white shark. And he said that he was aboard the USS Indianapolis when it was sunk, and that he shook his buddy one morning, and he had been eaten at the bottom by the bottom of his life jacket, and he was dead laying there in his life jacket. Quint, I understand, never was aboard the Indianapolis. They took this out of a book that I helped write 25 years ago, and this happened to me, and I shook a buddy of mine thinking that he'd gone to sleep, and when I shook him, he rolled upside down and a shark had eaten him. I never did see a shark bite a man, but a man would drift away from a group maybe 10 feet at night, and if he ever did, at night, you'd hear him scream and you would never see him again. In the picture Jaws, Quint said that 6 men per hour were eaten by sharks. I don't agree with this. The mathematics are just a little bit better than that. We swam 109 hours, and I know that a bunch of men drowned. There was 300 of us picked up. There was 300 of them possibly went down with the ship. It wasn't a matter of arguing over it or something like that. But the next morning, we found out we had an officer in our group. He said, "Fellas, y'all be quiet." He said, "I want you to count off now, and let's see how many men are in this group." And there was 157 in the group. We counted off, and out of that 157, 27 of us made it. And we estimated from that ratio how many fellows that we thought might have gotten off of the ship. I know that out of the 157 that we had there, we were probably as good as swimmers as any of the rest of them. But the next thing that this man said, he said, "I think that we ought to pray." And I don't know what took him so long. I've been praying since midnight. But I agreed with him. We ought to be praying. And he said, "I'll lead off a prayer, and then anybody that felt led, you just follow along, and maybe each and every one of you would want to pray." And I think everybody there did. And he started off by explaining to the Lord where we were. He said, "The nearest land is 250 miles from here. And he said, Lord, I don't want to die. And he said, we're out here now without any transportation, and I'd like to be picked up. I've got a few things I want to do. And he, virtually the same kind of prayer that everybody prayed. It came my turn to pray, and people, I had learned to pray over a body of fish. And I had learned that the Lord answers your prayer when you pray with faith. And he had given me an extra portion of faith. I explained to the Lord all over again where we were. I didn't want him to miss us. And that I still had a lot I wanted to do, and I had a young family at home, and that I wanted to go home to them. But when I got through asking him something, I thanked him for answering my prayer. And I said, I just praise you, Lord, that you answer prayer. In the Bible it tells you that if you pray with faith, you're going to answer our prayers. Now I'm using all the faith that you've given me, and I know I'm going to be picked up, and I just thank you for it. About 45 minutes or an hour later, this same man said, Joel, shut up, I want to tell you something. He said, we are the flagship for the 5th Fleet. Well, he wasn't telling us anything we didn't know. And he said the nearest land is 250 miles out on a truck, and it's held by the Japanese. And he said that we were not able to get off an SOS. Well, I don't know how he knew that. I didn't think that we did either, but then he made this as a definite statement. He said we're not traveling in a ship lane. So he said we don't stand one chance out of 1,000 of being picked up, so y'all just will start drowning and dying and giving up. Can you imagine somebody saying something to a group of men like that in the shape that they were in? Well, I called his hand real quick. And I said, fellow, I thought I heard you pray. He said, I did pray. I said, didn't you pray to be picked up? Yeah, I prayed to be picked up. I said, what's the matter? Don't you believe? I said, in the first place, you didn't even know where we are. The nearest land's 2.5 miles straight down. We're in about the 2nd deepest place in the Pacific. And I said, you know, I prayed I was going to be picked up, and I listened very carefully to your prayer. Only thing is, the difference between you and I, you say give up. Fellow, I'm going to be picked up. There may be 1,199 of you fellows give up and drown, but when old Gause is out there hitchhiking, a plane's or a ship or something's going to come along and pick me up, I'm going home. Let me tell you something. Somebody asked me today at the college, said, did you get scared after that? I said, let me tell you, I was scared to death prior to that. But when I spoke out and said, the Lord is going to answer my prayer, and I'm going home, and I voiced it in front of 157 men, I want to tell you something. Not one time out of the 109 hours after that did I ever doubt that I was going to be picked up. I didn't doubt it one bit. I had a perfect peace of mind about it. I never even thought about it, about when we was going to be, how we were going to be picked up or anything. I thought a lot about when we were going to be picked up, but I didn't think a thing about whether I was going to be picked up or not. All kind of things would happen to you out there. If a fella came up and told you anything after the 2nd day, you believed it. Or a certain number of them believed it. They'd tell you anything. One day one of the fellows said, hey, there's an island over here, and you can swim over there and get all the fresh water you want. There's a bunch of geisha girls that come out and give you some fresh water. Don't go ashore, said there's some Japanese on there. Don't go ashore, but they'll come out and give you all the fresh water. And about 4 or 5 guys shoved off. We never saw them again. You'd get in a fight over nothing. I don't know why fellas fought. And there was some fella always cutting that rope for some reason or other and scattering the crowd out, and you'd have to tie the rope back. A lot of fellas wore their shoes. They didn't take their shoes off, and you ladies know how your hands get all wrinkled up when you've had them in water too long. Well, I stayed in water so long that the soles of my feet came off. And when you get in water that long and a fella kicks you, it creates an ulcer. And so there were scraps going on constantly. One day a fella came up and he said, he said, there's plenty of water, fresh water 15 feet down, and a guy pulled his life jacket and went to diving for it, and it wasn't long before he drowned. I could go on and tell you all evening about little instances that happened there. But when a guy drank salt water, and I begged the boys not to drink any salt water, Some of them were just burned so terribly that they were out of their mind and they drank salt water anyway. But when a guy drank salt water, within 5 minutes he'd spit up an old green bile, and within 10 minutes he got out of his life jacket. And the reason he came out of his life jacket, you'd bounced up and down in it so long that you had no flesh under your arm. You could wiggle your fingers and see the cords there, and it was quite painful. And the first thing they did when they went crazy would get rid of the pain, and they'd take that life jacket off, and it wouldn't be but just a minute or two then. And I was separating two of my buddies that were fighting there one day. But before that, I want to tell you, I didn't get real thirsty. Your body soaked up enough of that salt water that I didn't really get thirsty. I got awful hungry, and I saw cans of peanuts and potatoes floating around. But the potatoes were so full of diesel oil, and we took diesel oil and rubbed it all over us. We rubbed it over us to keep the sun from burning us up in the daytime, and we rubbed it on our life jackets to keep them from getting soaked up with water, because we figured we might have to be there more than 72 hours, and it paid off. Somebody asked me today, how'd you stay afloat 109 hours when your life jacket's only good for 72? Well, that had a great deal to do with it, rubbing it with diesel oil. But I was separating these two guys, and a big wave hit me in the face, and I drank some salt water. And having seen what happened to some of the fellows, and there was life jackets floating all over the place, then I swam out there and got me another life jacket and pulled it back there, and I got my buddy to tie it on me backwards. I was swimming with a port list anyway. Somebody had told one of the boys that I had a canteen of water in the port side of my life jacket, and he had cut the K-pock out of it looking for it. So I tied this life jacket on, I tied this life jacket on backwards, or got it tied on me in a hard knot, and sure enough, I went out of my head that afternoon, and I swam off from the group. But fellas, I want to tell you how the Lord looked after me. I swam all night long, and I didn't bother with a shark, and the shark didn't bother with me. I didn't have a bit of trouble in the world. The only trouble that I had, I heard a group talking over here, and I heard a group talking over here, and I thought I was in the Civil War, and I didn't know which one were the Yankees and which one were the rebels, and I was afraid to go to either one of them. And I dreamed, it was like a bad dream. I dreamed that my wife was with me, and I said, Shug, you got to get me some lemonade. I don't even care for the stuff. And I don't know why I had to have some lemonade, but that thing came up, and I could go on about the things that I thought about during the night. They're all very vivid, and I remember them very well. And the next morning, about 9 o'clock, 8 or 9 o'clock, I began to straighten up and look around, and I began to come back to my senses, and I was all by myself. And I figured that 1,199 of them had drowned, and there I was out there by myself, and that was a lonesome feeling. Just a little bit later, I heard a fellow over on the horizon hollering, hey, Mulvey, hey, Mulvey. There was a boatswain mate on our ship that had told him the day before, he said, y'all hold me up tonight, because the ship came up yesterday. I know where it is, and I'll take you all over to it in the morning. Get all the fresh water and Geedunk that you want. Geedunk's ice cream in the Navy. And Mulvey had been sunk before, and he knew his time was just about up, and he needed some help. And so some of them had held him up. But one of these guys that had diesel oil in his eyes and couldn't see 3 feet had misplaced Mulvey. And he was hollering, hey, Mulvey, he wanted some of that ice cream and water. And I heard him way over there, and I started swimming to get back to him just as hard as I could. And I swam, and about 11 o'clock I got back to him. And by the time I got back, I had about that much freeboard. That's how much of me was sticking out of the water, in case you don't know what freeboard is. That everything else was submerged. And I had reared back so long, I didn't have any skin or flesh on the back of my neck. I was rearing back there to get a little breath of air. And I got back to the group. The group wasn't near as big as it was when I'd left it. I want to tell you about another little prayer that I gave right then. And you hear all kind of beautiful prayers, and thank goodness we've got some wonderful guys that can pray. But I got down to serious facts with him. I said, Lord, I prayed that I was going to be picked up. And I prayed with faith. And the Bible tells you that if you pray with faith, you're going to be picked up, so I don't doubt it. I know I'm going to be picked up. But Lord, I've done everything that I can possibly do on my own. You've got to get on the ball now and do something. I talked to him just like that. Get on the ball, Lord, let's do something. You know, the Lord taught me that as long as you're trying to do something on your own, you don't need the Lord's help. You're just wasting your time. You're wasting your time. I stood on bottom where it was 2.5 miles deep. We didn't have a sandbar there, and we didn't have a rock pile, and we didn't have anything else. I might have stood in the Lord's hand. I don't know what it was, but fellas, I want to tell you something. Ladies, I stood on something. My wife was an atheist, or an agnostic at that time. And I came home and I was talking about this thing, and I was talking about it, and she would hear me talk. I couldn't help but talk about it all the time I talked about it. She's one of the greatest little Christians today you ever met in all of your life. She's teaching in this Bible class. She teaches 250 women every Wednesday morning. Her tapes go all over the country. She taught in Israel the summer before last, and she taught in Sweden the summer before that. And she has become, if nothing else happened from this, my wife became a Christian. But I stood on bottom where it was 2.5 miles deep, and I rested, and I rested, and I rested. I might have even slept some, I don't know, but I remember I didn't even hurt under the arms. Just a little while after that, a plane flew over. For years, I couldn't even talk about that plane. We had had a plane fly over. You could almost set your watch by it. A plane flew over almost every 4 hours. And this plane that came out that morning, the pilot lives in California. His name's Gwen. He's a very close friend of mine today. He was having trouble with his plane, and so he got in a big Aventura, another plane, and they went out, and he didn't know it, but they were having aerial trouble on that plane. And he had a man on his knees trying to wind the aerial in. It was one of these old aerials that you throw behind a bomber back there then, and he was winding this aerial in and looking down, and boy, we were down there waving and hollering and taking on as loud as we could, and you know how much good that does when these planes are probably flying on instruments. Anyway, this guy saw a group of them, and the plane was just about the size of a seagull in the distance at that time, and when he got up to the pilot to tell him that there was a submarine down there, he had seen a submarine on the surface, and the pilot banked around like this, and 4 or 5 fellows in my group went crazy and drowned right then. They couldn't stand it. He came back, and he didn't fly over us. He flew over some of the other guys out there. Fred, I guess I'm kind of getting tired. Been talking since Friday. Anyway, he came back, and he flew over a group of fellows there, and he got all ready to open his bomb bay doors and drop some depth charges, and saw that they were sailors. And he didn't know whether they were Japanese sailors or what they were, but he closed the bomb bay door, and he wobbled his wings, and that was the greatest thing in the world. And I'd see him fly around, and he'd wobble his wings every now and then, but I couldn't get him to come over us. He just kept flying around in an area and wobbling his wings here and there, and we knew that there was other people out there. We thought for a while that we were the only ones. Finally, he came over us, and I knew how to semaphore. And I grabbed a couple of guys' hats, and I was flagging him like this, drop some water, drop some water. Gwen said he never did see any flagging going on down there, but he dropped 5-gallon can of water with a life jacket wrapped around it. He dropped it about 100 yards from us, and I said, man, why'd you drop it out there so far? He said, Bob, he said, I didn't want to drop it on you and kill some of you. So he dropped it off to one side, and I was the only man in my group with enough strength. I had rested. I swam out and got the 5 gallons of water. I didn't worry about the sharks. I just swam out there and got it. It had burst open, and all the fresh water was gone. There was an empty can there, and I had seen some fellows get killed while in the life jacket. And I knew that I would be the next one if I went back there with an empty can without a hole in it. And I dragged that can back and showed the guys. I said, look, it burst open. I didn't have any water to drink. In a little while, he dropped a 5-man life raft, and we got that life raft back. And a man got up on the life raft, and it had a medicine kit on there. And he began to pull sailors up on the life raft and look them over, and he was going to give everybody that he could a shot that was beat up and banged up pretty bad. Well, I was banged up pretty bad, and he came to me, and he recognized me, and he said, Conk, I'm going to give you a shot of morphine because you're hurt pretty bad. I said, no, I'm not. I said, I've rested. I'm in good shape. It isn't going to be but just a little while now that help's going to be here. Give it to somebody that needs it. Killed every man that he gave it to. Some of you doctors might understand that. Everybody was so dehydrated and run down that a shot of morphine was all it took. Now, I say that it killed them. I've worried and I've worried and I've thought about this. Boy, they went out like a light, bam, like that, and you couldn't feel any pulse. And this fellow had us take their dog tags off and their clothes off and shove them overboard and make room for somebody else on the raft. Well, I got rid of my life jacket. When I got up on this thing, I thought at the time, and while I was floating around out there, I said, man, I'll save this thing when I get home. I'm going to put this up over my mantle. This is going to be a keepsake for the rest of my life. But as quick as I could get to that life raft and get out of that life jacket, I forgot all about it. And I saw this seaplane come out. A PBY came out and landed, and he was taxiing around picking guys up. And this Vigaventura had sent off a radio message. He said, send some help quick. He quit sending it by code and said, I'll fly over a group and there's 25 men in it, and I'll fly over them again in 15, 20 minutes, there's 20. He said, these guys are dying like flies. And they're scattered all over the Pacific out here. Send some help. And the message never did get to the commander of the base at Peleliu. They sent one lousy PBY out there, and he landed against orders. And it split the rivets on the plane when he landed. And I could see this plane circling around, and he wasn't picking up groups of fellows. Fellows began to scatter when the help was coming like that, and he was picking up scattered guys. So I told this fellow that was hanging on the raft, I said, hey, you want to get on this raft? I'll trade you my place on the raft for your life jacket. And I swam then and cut this plane off. And I was the last man that was picked up on the PBY. I found out after the war that the man that reached out the bubble on this PBY and picked me up runs a building supply place just 30 miles from my hometown. And he was telling one of my truck drivers one day, he said, one of the survivors off the Indianapolis was named Gause. He said, that's my boss. And he came home and told me about it, and I jumped right in the car and went over to see him. But anyway, we got on this plane, and that night, the Cecil C. Doyle, the Secretary of the Navy today, was the skipper on the Cecil C. Doyle, a little destroyer escort, had heard this message, and he, without orders, turned and came at flank speed, and he wasn't going to get there by dark, and so when it got dark, he turned his 16-inch spotlight up on the low-hanging cloud like this, and it ricocheted off of it and looked like a beam coming from heaven, and I don't know how many people held on to that beam that night. Then he turned on all of the lights on the ship, regardless of the danger of a submarine, and turned two big spotlights down in the water like that so that he wouldn't run over anybody when he got up there. And they transferred me to that ship. You see how many times the Lord spared my life? He gave me a case of boils so that I wouldn't go below deck. The day that we were hit with the suicide plane, I was supposed to have gone down and rousted my men out of a pinochle game where they were playing pinochle and get them to clean up the bridge and stuff. We were right off of Okinawa. And a suicide plane came in, killed every man in the pinochle game, and I was still on the bridge. Then he spared me when I didn't take a shot, and he spared me all night when I swam, and a shark didn't bother me. I was telling Freddie about he spared me not very long ago. A hitchhiker stuck a knife in my side and wanted to pull something. I led him to the Lord in the next 17 miles, and he put his knife up. The Lord's got something for us to do. He had something for me to do. I'm not a very well-educated man, but I've got some doctorates working for me. But I want to tell you something. I got the most educated partner in the world. And I take things to him constantly. And it has paid off. When he was talking about prayer and why some prayers aren't answered, you know, I think every prayer is answered if your life is right with God when you pray it. And I think you have to get into an attitude of prayer. If you've got something against this lady, and you say, boy, she really turned the crank, and maybe if I ever get a chance, I'm going to get back at her. You better tear up that debt before you ask God for something. You better tear it up. You better love your fellow man. Then you've got what I call a direct line. And let me tell you something. I have to clear that line up constantly. I've got about 10 or 15 corporations going. If you don't think that in 10 or 15 corporations that you get messed up to where your line's all clogged up, you're wrong. I have to clear that up. And in my business today, I put together groups of fellows and buy up fairly large pieces of real estate. And I'll tell you how I work this prayer bit. I pray about it. And if something starts going wrong with it, little things going wrong that I could possibly clear up, I back off and leave it alone and say, thank you, Lord. And I go on and I find me something else. And if that starts falling into place, I buy it. And I haven't bought a piece like that I haven't doubled my money on. But once in a while I find a piece that looks so good that I don't need the Lord. My goodness alive, a man can't do anything but get rich on this, and I just buy it and I've lost my shirt. I use it in everyday business. Let me tell you something. There's not a couple in here tonight that had any more trouble than I had when I was married to a little agnostic or atheist. You all don't know what trouble is. I've had it. My wife and I pray together. We've been married 39 years. I got 4 Christian children, 7 grandchildren. You could have it too. I'm sure that you all are Christian, most of you. There might be somebody here that isn't. There might be somebody here that wants to learn more about faith and how you get your prayers answered. I'm not a preacher. I'm just a businessman. But I'm a businessman that knows what God says to you about prayer. I know what He says to you about answering prayer. I know what He says to you about loving your fellow man. I got embarrassed tonight when you said something about you need to take up a collection for this fellow. He came from Florida and it's a lot of expense. You don't need to take up a collection for me. It's all going to go to Florida Beacon College. The Lord's provided every time I've ever wanted to go anywhere, I go at my expense. The Lord provides it because He wants me to talk to somebody. Maybe I only spoke to one person while I came out here to the West Coast. Maybe I'm speaking to you. People, you pray with faith. The Lord doesn't give you all the faith at one time that He's got in store for you. There's not one of you big enough to handle it. You take a bureaucrat. We got a lot of those in our government. You give him a little bit of power, so he's going to take the rest of it and run the world. You see what a job, what a mess he makes out of it? That's what you'd do too if God gave you all the faith that He has in store for you at one time. He lets it grow, and the more you use it, the more you can handle. Some of you might have needs here tonight. I have a need. I take my need to the Lord. In my house, you talk about a healing ministry. In my house, we have a Bible class every Monday night. We have for about 4 years. And I've had some of the greatest healings that I've ever seen in my life right there in my home. You talk about miracles. The greatest miracle in the world is that miracle of everlasting life. And you can have that just for asking for it. It's so simple that it's hard to leave a college professor to the Lord. He thinks it's too simple. He says if you come as a little child. He doesn't say come as a graduate. Come as a little child. Anybody here that wants that tonight that haven't had it, I would just be happy and so pleased that He might use me one more time to show you that all you need to do is admit that you're a sinner and ask God's forgiveness, then ask Jesus into your life. And it doesn't say one word in the Bible that He's only going to forgive one sin. It says that He's going to forgive all of them. You may only think of 1 or 2 of them. He'll put 1 or 2 of them in your mind. But it doesn't say that He's only going to forgive, and He doesn't say anywhere in there that maybe I'll forgive them. It says, I will. And then He says, I will come into your life. He's come into mine. How many of you have that same feeling in this room? Thank goodness. Listen, time's growing short. You ought to really get out and talk about it like I do. And I'm sure that a lot of you do. I'm not a speaker, but I never turn down an opportunity to tell somebody about Jesus Christ. I just thank you so much for inviting me here tonight. This has been about the greatest weekend I think I've ever had. I couldn't hardly talk this morning talking to that bunch of college kids there that are training to be missionaries and training to be pastors, and that's what we've got at Florida Beacon. It's just a little tiny college. We don't have but about 65 or 70 students. We've got a great big overhead. We could handle twice that many students, and we're fixing to have them. There's a Christian television broadcasting station fixing to go on our campus right away. It's already been approved, and this Project Look Up that some of you are familiar with, that satellite program, is going to be located, I think, on Florida Beacon College's campus. Oral Roberts, look out. We're on our way. I just enjoy so much speaking with you folks. You know, I was telling Fred that it really does me just as much good as it does anybody else for me to get out here and share with you. You need to do this, and you need to be built up from the surrounding Christians that you're talking with. And I was beginning to get stale. I had just gotten out of the hospital a few weeks ago, and I kind of got stale while I was in there. I missed out on some of my fishing, too. Let me tell you one thing about fishing. Fred told it on me last night. I told Fred one time, I said, Fred, I caught a fish one time that measured 3 feet. And he said, you did? And he was fixing to tell me about the one that he caught that was that big, too. And then I said, mine was 3 feet between the eyes. And I was telling him the truth. I caught a hammerhead shark that you could lay a yardstick right between his eyes. We pulled 15 feet of him out of the water, and it held the record in the state of Florida for a number of years. 3 years ago, somebody beat my record, but I'm not going to try to tie it. Thank you so much for inviting me out.
Thank you so much, Bob, for sharing that exciting testimony of that God meets us right where we are, that we don't necessarily have to go to Him. All we have to do is say, God, if you're real, prove it to me. I need to know you.